Allow me to introduce myself.
I am the last sane sports fan.
I am a genius by trade.
I just knew too much. Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly.
Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. Well, let's get right into it. I know that last week that I had said I wasn't going to talk about NFL this week because I didn't want to get into that kind of muck and mire that goes on in the 2 weeks in between the Super Bowl. But there was something that came out here recently that I do feel the need to kind of touch on. And it's, again, kind of going back to that other video that I did not too long ago about the inherent unfairness that goes on with the NFL relocation process. And again, we've kind of gotten more news, more rumors coming out in regards to that. And the latest thing is that supposedly the NFL is willing to give the San Diego Chargers $300 million towards a potential new stadium to stay in San Diego. Now, I understand from a business standpoint where this is coming from because, quite frankly, I think that it is settling into the heads of a lot of the owners, a lot of the NFL bigwigs, that they would be better served to only have one team in the LA market. That way you're not spreading yourself too thin. You've only got one team in this gigantic new stadium. You don't have to worry about scheduling conflicts and all this kind of stuff. You don't have to worry about, okay, well, we're going to have this team play on Thursday and then another home game for the other team on Sunday and vice versa. It really does better serve the area to only have the one team. So I get that. But again, the NFL it just doesn't keep track of their lies, which is why you don't start lying. St. Louis would have been very upset given the way things went down if it went down that way no matter what, which obviously it was going to. But the NFL lied every step of the way. Every step of the way, Roger Goodell and his cronies sat there and said that they were more than willing to allow home markets that put in the effort, did the process, went through all the right channels, the best opportunity to keep their team. No city did that more than St. Louis. San Diego has not really put forth a large effort, at least in terms of the government, to get funding together for a stadium, and Dean Spanos has been trying to do it for 10 or more years. Oakland did the least. Oakland did absolutely nothing. Oakland said, if you want to leave, see you later. Thanks for the revenue that you gave us while we were here. St. Louis wasted $16 million on the process. Now, that's not just the city. There are other enterprises and whatnot that went into that. But $16 million was spent on putting together the plans, getting together meetings, meeting with officials. I mean, they did kind of skirt a lot of the legal processes. There probably should have been a public vote. That was kind of circled around. Now, you can debate the merits of that all you want, and it really doesn't matter anymore because St. Louis doesn't have a team. But the bottom line was, in the plan, the NFL kind of shot down the St. Louis project because they said, well, we've never given out as much money as St. Louis is including in their plan to get from the NFL. Well, that number was, I believe, $300 million. And ultimately they said, well, that's not correct because we've never given out that much. We never intend to give out that much. And then a week or two later, they come out and say, well, San Diego, we're willing to give you $300 million to try to keep the Chargers in San Diego. This is the NFL just not caring, once again, that they're caught in a lie because they know that nobody ultimately will hold them accountable. People are still going to watch on TV. People are still going to buy from their advertising partners. People are still going to buy jerseys and tickets. People are still going to buy in to this behemoth that is the NFL. So really, there is no holding the NFL accountable in situations like this. And from a St. Louis perspective, all we would have liked to have known is, hey, your owner wants to go to LA. He's going to give the league a bunch of free stuff. He's going to have us a media center out there, a lot of area for the NFL to work with. Basically, NFL 2.0 in terms of meeting spaces and offices and what have you. A lot of their stuff is obviously going to remain in New York, but this is going to be built all for free on Kroenke's dime. So we're going to take this offer. And sorry, St. Louis, but you lose out. That would have stuck in a lot of people's craws, but quite frankly, it wouldn't have pissed off any more people than they did the way that they did things and the way that they lied to the people, the way they lied to the people in the process, telling them that they needed $400 million when it was always going to be $700 million. And it's just another example of the people in the office, Roger Goodell in particular, just lying to the people and not really caring. It's like, well, I'm basically a politician. They'll forget what I said a couple weeks ago because they need to trust what I'm saying now. It's ultimately a ridiculous situation. But I didn't want to spend too much time on that. Wanted to get towards the main topic of the day, which was the All Star game, the 2016 NHL All Star game. I'm not touching the Pro Bowl because I think of all the All Star games, which are all kind of ridiculous at this point, the Pro Bowl is the worst. But the NHL All Star game, I don't know how to feel about it because on the one hand, the way it started off, I quite frankly thought it was somewhat entertaining. The Atlantic against the Metropolitan, I thought was a fairly good game. I thought the Atlantic versus the Pacific was a good game. But from the stuff that you see around me, I was obviously rooting for the Central Division, and they came out and laid an egg. Granted, they scored 6 goals because they had the most talent out of anybody. They were even mentioning it during the game, how most people were prognosticating the Central Division, at least on paper, should have won that game. Now, obviously, that's why you go out, you play the games, because on paper, you would never know. You'd have boring opportunities and nobody would be interested. But based on pure talent alone, you look at the roster that the NHL Central had at its disposal, they should have cleaned house. But instead, they looked the least interested in being there. You had Jaromir Jagr at what is he, 44, 41, something like that. He looked more interested in playing those games than any of the NHL Central players. For whatever reason, they refused to shoot. And this was kind of a story throughout a lot of the games that happened during the All-Star game. And for those of you who are unaware, it was 3-on-3, kind of a tournament. The Atlantic took on the Metropolitan Division and the Central took on the Pacific Division, and then the winners played each other. Well, the Central Division did nothing but cycle the puck around. I mean, quite frankly, I thought I was watching a Blues game. They refused to shoot the puck when they had opportunities, and I understand that it's an all-star game, that you're not going to give it back to Shea Weber at the point, and he's not going to wind up and take a slap shot as hard as he can, because there's kind of a decorum going on, that you're doing your best not to injure your opponents, because nobody wants to hurt an opponent or even one of their teammates in an all-star game, forcing them to stretch too much or something like that, and therefore they can't play the rest of the season or miss a good chunk of the rest of the season. But that said, you're watching an all-star game to see the best talents in the world put their talents forth, and I didn't want to see a bunch of millionaires cycling the puck around looking for pretty plays and one-timers. When you've got a shot open in the slot, don't pass it off to the guy on the side of the net. Take the shot. I want to see Vladimir Tarasenko going up against Jonathan Quick, and you didn't get to see that because for whatever reason, the players on the Central in particular decided they didn't want to shoot it. They were going to always try to pass it off to the side, set up the one-timer, go for that empty net goal. And again, I get the idea that you're not wanting to injure the goaltenders, you're not wanting to injure the defensemen that are trying to go down and maybe get a stick on the puck. But nobody wants to see cycling the puck around. The whole idea behind 3-on-3 was to open things up and get more goals in the situation. And when you ended up, I mean, it's kind of an odd situation because my argument seems to kind of fold in on itself in regards to that game that the Central played, because that one had the most goals out of any of them. but the Central sort of destroyed everybody out there, and that is an opinion, but it is based on fact, because you've got some of the leading goal scorers throughout the entire NHL. You've got Jamie Benn, you've got Patrick Kane, you've got Tyler Seguin, you've got Vladimir Tarasenko, you've got some of the better defenders in the league on that team, and they just didn't seem to care. Out of all the teams, it was extremely disappointing that the Central, with the most talent, seemed to care the least. Now, you could chalk that up to the Central teams seem to have played more games than some of their NHL opponents, but we're talking about 2 or 3 games at most here. I don't know that that makes that much of a difference in terms of being that much more tired and being that much less interested, and it was extremely disappointing to see. I think going forward, the NHL is probably going to stick with this format. The one positive that came out of the NHL All Star game was John Scott got the MVP award. His team ended up winning, so they get to share that $1 million. I thought that was good for the game, because I thought this whole scenario with John Scott was ridiculous from the start. It was ridiculous that the fans voted him in, but once he was in, he deserved to be in. He was voted in by the fans. Whether it was a legitimate trade or whether it was organized by the league, I thought it was ridiculous how they tried to shut him out by sending him to the Canadiens, and then the Canadiens saying that they had no intention of bringing him up to the NHL roster. If that was a legitimate trade, then the Canadiens are well within their rights to say that they have no intentions of using this player on the NHL roster, barring any injuries. But having said that, it still should not have barred him from the NHL All Star game. Now, the NHL did do the right thing eventually by keeping him on the roster, but they weren't going to until the fans got pretty upset that all of a sudden this guy, who, love him or hate him, has been a pretty good guy throughout the entire process. And the NHL was kind of being a little bit shady about this, and then they're like, "Oh, well, no, he'll be there, and we're happy that he's there." And they tried to play nicey nice, when, quite frankly, they didn't want him there. They were a little bit embarrassed by this entire situation, but they could have avoided the entire ordeal if they would have just let John Scott be in there. It wouldn't have gotten as much media attention as it eventually did, and they could have corrected the process in the future. Limit the number of choices that you have to vote for the NHL captains of each division, because there's only a certain amount of players that really deserve to be voted in as captains of those teams anyway, so you don't need to open it up to the entire league. So you just limit the amount of choices that people have anyway, because the fan vote is, quite frankly, ridiculous anyway, because you look at the Central Division, based on population alone, St. Louis will probably never get a captain of the Central Division, because it's always going to be either Chicago or Dallas getting a player in there as the captain. And then if the captains don't get to choose the team and the fans don't get to choose the team, it's ultimately kind of an odd situation anyway. So the whole thing was kind of overblown. There are tweaks that can be made to the system going forward, but I see the NHL kind of sticking with this 3-on-3. I do think it generated a little bit more interest in the game, playing kind of a mini tournament there. They do need to kind of condense it, find a way to I understand that people need warm-up time before each individual game, but there was too much time in between games. It was not just the amount of time that you would have in an intermission, so therefore you lost a little bit of the momentum, and it took away some out of that. But ultimately, although I was very upset with the way that the Central played and the way the overall tournament turned out, I do think it was kind of an interesting thing, a little bit of a tweak on the overall premise. And I mean, it's an all-star game. Who really cares in the end? But it'll be interesting to see what goes on going forward. That is the view from the Midwest. What are your views on the topics? What do you think about the NFL, trying to give $300 million when they said they were not going to give that much to anybody, and now they're going to give that much to San Diego if they so choose? What do you think about the NHL All Star game? What do you think about the format and who won? Let me know in the comments section. Other than that, comment, rate, and subscribe as always, whether on Facebook or YouTube. Until the next time, I'll see you then.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo and so much